Okay, someone asks how we should go about abolition. I think you'll find the most comprehensive information as one great website where a lot of different questions will be answered is the website Nordic Model Now. Most of you probably, if you've been following me a while, you already know it. It's run by British abolitionist feminists, and it describes this legislation that's already been enacted in about 8 countries at this stage. I will definitely make a space about prostitution policy as well. It is very complicated. Like, I can talk all day long about how the sex trade is horrible and how Germany is failing. You could also make a presentation how the countries who are trying this approach are also not necessarily doing a great job. Recently, especially Canada. I do think we can abolish prostitution. Obviously, I wouldn't be an advocate otherwise, but I'm not going to pretend like it's not extremely hard. And also, like, this legislation that came originally from Sweden, also in Norway or Iceland, that conditions in these countries are obviously different from, for example, the US, and that you can translate this policy and just implement it in the US. Okay, so maybe I should just briefly summarize what the model is like. The basic idea, and then you have to figure out what works in your region, in your country, with the kind of system that you have. So maybe you will only adapt some of it, or you'll change the details around. But the basics is you do decriminalize the sex seller, and you really try to minimize any ways that she could still be criminalized. Unfortunately, again, the details of this are tricky. Maybe it's important to say in countries like Germany or New Zealand, there are always regulations on the sex trade. So she could still get in trouble for things like not using a condom or being in the wrong part of town because there are zoning laws, or migrant women still get deported. And you can eliminate at least many of these by recognizing the women in sex trade as existing in an exploitative violent system, so that we don't first look at, oh, what rules did she break? But we look at the system around her and we try to minimize the situations where she could be criminalized. That goes so far as to say that I think you shouldn't be punished for selling sex. You shouldn't be punished for using like your own home as a brothel, for example. You shouldn't be punished for soliciting and or for advertising all these things. And when the authorities interact with you, they should look into how can you be supported. What do you need? Do you need help with childcare? Do you need trauma therapy? Many women do want to get out, and we just don't have exit services in a system that normalizes prostitution. But one of the core parts of this would be saying not how can we find something wrong? Did she break a rule? Did she maybe trade a bit of drugs, which many women are forced to do in their circumstances? We're not looking into that. We're looking into how can we support her. Again, this is not going to be perfect because you need where does the money come from for these support services? Especially, how can we convince the German government to invest in women rather than tax them? I mean, definitely not an easy feat, but that would be part of it. So women or men or trans people in the sex trade focus on support, not, again, any types of small levels of crime that they may or may not have been involved in. But you still criminalize sex buyers and pimps. So it's not okay to profit from someone else. Right now in Germany, we believe that there are ethical pimps, that some people just, same way that others run base, some run brothels. That would not be acceptable under this model. There's evidence of you profiting off of someone, that's a serious crime. And this would, if done well, make it easier. It'll still be hard. It's never going to be easy, but this will also help trafficking victims, because right now, this is really important to understand, a lot of traffickers are running around casting themselves as ethical pimps. They're getting away with it because profiting off of someone in prostitution is currently legal. Victims then have to, in court, prove that there was violent coercion, and that is so hard. And instead, we need a legislation that doesn't rely on victim testimony, which is incredibly emotionally taxing, which puts her at risk of violence from organized crime. Right? Some of these gangs, they will straight up murder her. They will murder women who speak up. So it has to be possible to investigate and react to human trafficking cases without the women screaming for help. And if we widen the definition of pimping, currently it's very narrow, if we widen it, which this legislation would do, it would be easier to go after these kinds of abusers. Also, it would be harder for them just straight up to groom women, because if there are no ethical pimps under the law and under societal learning, then he can't, which some pimps currently can and do, go up to a woman or young girl and say, this is just a job opportunity, and, help groom her in that way. And like I mentioned, sex buyers too would be criminalized. It's not, right? I talked about some of the worst today, right? I talked about the killers, and definitely the average John is not a killer. He's just this regular guy who doesn't want to think too deeply about why women sell sex, who doesn't want to think too deeply about her backstory, the consequences, the hurt that he might be causing or likely is causing. And this model just understands there is no ethical sex buying, because even the man who doesn't add additional violence, he never knows what her story is. He doesn't know what's going on. He has no foolproof way of verifying any type of meaningful. Chances are he's exploiting at least someone's poverty, quite possibly also trafficking. So even the man who doesn't go in and like sadistically wants to hurt someone, even he can't know for sure. He might be committing a rape. And that's fundamentally unacceptable. Like, we hold men to a higher standard. You can't go throwing money at poor women. That's not consent. That's not a part of an equitable society. Oh yeah, and part that connects to that last part of the Nordic model, educating society, like changing the mindset in society. This is a very important part. How to prevent the sex trade. And again, I think it shouldn't actually be focused on women and girls, because it's not their fault. It's the surrounding circumstances that push them into it. And like, I understand people say like, oh, we're not going to get rid of the sex trade before we don't get rid of, poverty, etc. You're not wrong. So we definitely need to work in tandem with anti-poverty efforts, anti-racism efforts, migrant empowerment, etc. Ending wars, which I know feels pretty hopeless right now, or yeah, I mean, wars have been going on in other regions of the world for a while. I mean, every social justice project should tie into the sex trade, because the sex trade happens at the intersection of all these issues. So these should all tie together to prevent the victimization. And centrally, we got to educate boys and men that that's not how you treat other people. Women and girls are not products. They're not sex toys. They don't exist for your pleasure. You meet them as equals. You meet them respectfully. And if you're lucky and she likes you, then go on and enjoy each other, but not through financial coercion. The landlord can't do it, and the sex buyer can't either. That should be what we raise boys with, what we tell young men.